What are the session objectives for today? We'll be starting with and we'll be focusing on learning how to identify research gaps using paper published in high ranked journals. There could be two types of gaps. There could be implicit gaps and there could be explicit gaps, and we'll be talking about both of them and why gaps are actually important. How do you store necessary information? Sometimes we see that people are reading a lot, but they are not storing necessary information, and we can't keep all this information in our mind and we can't just reproduce it while we are writing. So we miss out on credible and required information while we are trying to write our research papers. So how do you store your necessary information and what information to be stored? How to write captivating and engaging introduction with focus on structure and format of a good introduction. To identify the key elements of a literature. To structure, format, and shape a critical literature review. To be able to propose and present research methodology. To gain an insight into identification of key analysis techniques that shall be used in a research study. To identify key ingredients of a research discussion and identify implications and propose limitations and future research directions. So these are the objectives for today's session. Starting with, we all have faced rejection. Even yesterday, I got a paper that was rejected. In the morning, I got this news that okay, this paper was rejected. So we all have faced rejection. Why was my paper rejected? There are very few reasons that one could identify that this was the reason or these were the reasons that the paper was rejected. If you counter these reasons before you submit your paper, there is a very significant chance that your paper will be accepted. These things might not be easy, but these things aren't impossible as well. The first thing, we normally are very in haste, we are submitting our papers to the journals without looking into the detail as to what is the domain of the journal, whether or not the journal publishes in the area in which we have written our paper. So before you submit your paper to any journal, visit that journal website, look at the scope of the journal, look at what papers are published and what areas they are interested in and what current areas they are publishing in. They might have published a paper on a particular concept maybe 2 years ago, maybe 6 months ago, but for the past 6 months they have been publishing on something else. So look for the domain of the journal, because this will save you time, because journal will take at least 2 to maybe 3 to 4 weeks just to initially process your manuscript, and then they might give you a rejection. So why lose this important and crucial time? Lack of clear identification of theory. Majority of the papers are rejected because there is no theory in the paper. So you have to identify how are you developing the relationship in the paper. Why is one variable related to another? In what theoretical context are you relating the paper? It's not enough to say that this variable is related to this variable because certain person did an empirical research. There has to be theoretical, or these relationships should be theory driven. For example, if I am working on knowledge management and organizational performance, I could find at least 30 papers just like by searching in Google Scholar. I could find 30-40 papers that would have assessed this relationship. But why am I doing it in my study? What theory would I use to describe this relationship? So theory would help you model your relationships. And there are times when you can't find any existing research on how different variables are related with each other. For example, recently I did a paper on entrepreneurial leadership and knowledge management. Well, there was no paper before my paper on how entrepreneurial leadership is linked to knowledge management. So what should I do? Shall I drop this idea of the paper? No, because I know in my mind, because I've read about entrepreneurial leadership, I've read about knowledge management, I know that these concepts are related. So what I did was, I went back to knowledge management literature and studied knowledge management literature and identified that, okay, these theories have been used in existing research to establish relationship between leadership and knowledge management. And then I drove this idea as to how knowledge management will be influenced by entrepreneurial leadership. And in that particular scenario, knowledge-based view helped me a lot in driving this information, in creating this relationship. So theory is important not just because you have to put in a theory because this will give weight to your paper. Theory is also important and will give you an idea when you do not have any empirical literature available on relationship between different concepts. Now, how do you identify the theory? We'll be talking about that as well. So lack of clear identification of research gaps and limitations. Now sometimes what happens is that we know that certain concept has not been studied in the literature. We can't find the concept. But what we do is we start writing our paper and we just say that there was no research, or the researchers or the authors could not find any research on the relationship. Well, this is very weak identification of the gap. Apart from just saying that you couldn't find a research on this particular topic, or Mr. So and so or Miss So and so has recommended this relationship, you have to explain why studying this relationship is important. You know what theoretical contribution is? Theoretical contribution is not what, it's not when, it's not how. It's not just adding factors into your model that have not been studied. Theoretical contribution is about why this relationship is important to be studied. Why this particular relationship is worth studying for the literature, for the concepts. What will this relationship explain for the readers? So make sure you are focusing on the why. If you fail to focus on the why, no matter how good your model is, no matter how novel your model is, your paper will be rejected. I've come across as a reviewer, I've seen papers, very good papers, very complex models, sometimes multi-level models with data collected from multiple sources at different time frames. But the problem was they could not clearly identify the research gaps or limitations in existing research. They couldn't explain that why aspect. So you need to identify why is this research important, and explain what it does for literature, what it does for these concepts, what it does for explaining these concepts. The manuscript fails to highlight the contribution of the study. Yes, you have identified the theory. Yes, you have clearly identified the research gaps and limitations, but you fail to mention the contributions of your study. What it does for the literature. So what you see, where are these contributions in existing research? These contributions are more or less normally the last paragraph of your introduction section. And in the discussion section, they are given under the heading of theoretical implications or sometimes implications. See how people are writing about these contributions, how they mention the contributions. And again, focus on the why aspect. Why this contribution is important. Relationships already tested. Sometimes what we do is we are already testing the same relationships that have been tested before. What we are doing is we are just copying or replicating a study that might be done in Pakistan. So I'm just doing that study in India now. That study was done in England, Australia, Canada, and now I'm doing that study in Pakistan or India or Saudi Arabia or UAE or any other country for that matter. This is replication. This has nothing to do with contribution. So you do not replicate the study as is. Add new variables, but not just add new variables, because that will satisfy the what aspect of your contribution. What are the factors that could affect a particular concept? You have to explain why adding these factors, why adding these mediators, why adding these moderators is important. Another important point is we do not define our concepts properly. And once they are not clearly defined, the measures that we use for our study are not clear. So make sure whenever you are studying a particular concept or you are studying different concepts and how they are related with each other, before you go into detail and identify the measures, the questionnaire, the scale for your study, you identify the definitions for that study. And those scales that you are using should be in light of or in line with the definition. Let me give you an example. Let's say I'm interested in studying social responsibility in universities. And what I do is I take the definition of Carroll. Now, if I take the definition of Carroll, the definition says that social responsibility has got four dimensions: economic, legal, ethical, and philanthropic. Now, if we see, I cannot use this definition in my study because I'm studying social responsibility in universities. Whereas Carroll says the basic, the most basic responsibility of the the corporations or the organizations is economic responsibility. But universities are not economic entities. They are not made for profits. Even the profit making universities, they never say out loud that yes, they are making profits or they are there for making profits. They hide this concept within the knowledge sharing, knowledge creation concepts. So here your operationalization is wrong. And if your operationalization is wrong, your end scale will be wrong. So make sure the operationalization that you are taking in should be properly thought of, because that will guide your scale. Look of critical literature that leads to hypothesis development. Sometimes what we do is, while we are writing our research paper, what we do is we do it like this. X 2020 said this, Y 2020 said this, Z 2020 said this, so I am saying this. Well, this is some kind of annotated bibliography. This is not critical literature. You have to correlate, complement, contradict the existing research that is available. Are these three studies X, Y, Z contradicting each other? Are they complementing each other? How are these three studies related with each other? And why these three studies are important for your study? So your literature has to be critical, and this is how you make your literature critical. Lack of appropriate methodology. Methodology means that you have used the right scale, you have used the right techniques, analytical techniques, you have used the right method to distribute the data, collect the data, you have used the right sampling technique. Sometimes we get these papers or these studies from our students and even the papers, and they've mentioned that we did simple random sampling. And they would have collected data from customers or maybe bank employees or maybe some other organizations or type of organizations. The only question that I put forward is that how did you do simple random sampling? The answer I get most of the time is just we went into the office, we went into this mall, we went into this bank and just distributed the questionnaire to people. Well, this is not random sampling. Random sampling is only possible when you know your population, when you have got details of every single member or element of the population to be selected as subject in your sample. So your methodology was not appropriate. The technique that you use might not have been or should not have been used. We'll be talking about this in detail in the coming sections as well. Your flow and structure. For example, you are mentioning things in the introduction that should have been mentioned in the literature. You're mentioning things in the methodology that should have been mentioned in the literature or the introduction. So your structure, your flow of argument should be very, very proper. And how do you develop this flow and structure? The only recommendation that I have, and the only thing that made me do this: read, read, and read. And take notes. Identify how a particular paper or how a particular scholar has started writing the paper. See, why do you see a particular kind of information always in the introduction? Most of the times you are not starting the paper by directly mentioning that Mr. So and so said that this particular variable should be studied. They normally start with identifying the need for research, identifying the need to study a particular concept. So this is how you should start your research. We'll be looking at a paper, for example, that how you can structure and decide the flow of your paper. Language, again, most of us, English is a second language. So we are not like native English speakers, so there will be problems with grammar and all. So what you need to do is you can use different tools. Like I use Grammarly. Once I've completed my paper, I put it in Grammarly and see the punctuation mistakes, the grammatical mistakes. And what you can do is you can give your paper to someone who's got good English and ask them, request them to read your paper, give them your suggestions. Now here are a few examples of my own papers rejected. Now, the first one, I failed to actually see the scope of the journal, and that's why my paper was rejected. And it took like 3 weeks to get the rejection, or 2 weeks more or less. So I lost valuable time that I could have invested in the paper. The second example, I did not check the guidelines. My manuscript was 11,429 words, whereas the journal allowed 7,000 words. Again, loss of maybe 2 to 3 weeks. Another example, see the journal methodology. Now, this is very important. Whenever you are submitting to a journal, download some of the papers from that journal and see how they are written. I submitted this paper to this journal and they rejected my paper because of poor analysis. Well, that was a shock actually, because I think I'm a good analyst. I'm good with analysis. But anyways, moving on. So they rejected my paper. And when I found out, they in all of their paper they look for goodness of fit or model fit. So what I did was I just added the goodness of model fit, resubmitted the paper again, and it went into review. But in order to save yourself this time, look at how they publish paper, look at how they write the methodology, what key things they are putting in the methodology, how they write the introduction, what are the analysis requirements. So all these things are particularly important. Again, we have talked about English, so try to make sure that your English, there are no errors, because even your paper is good, all the things that you have that might get your paper rejected, all these things are not there. It has got clear identification of theory, everything is clear, but the problem is with language. This creates a very bad impression and your paper will be rejected. And finally, address the comments. Sometimes what we are so much in a rush that we do not see the comments of the reviewers, and what we do is we just try to rush through the changes and submit it again. What's the rush? Why are we rushing? If they have given us 6 months, they would have thought that these changes will take time, and if we submit our paper within 2 weeks, they will reject it. Make sure that you take your time, make sure that you address each and every comment. Sometimes what we do is we try to cut corners and we delete the reviewer comments based on our own understanding. Okay, this is not important. Every single thing is important. Even if they have mentioned that okay, this paper is a good paper, you have to acknowledge that as well in your response to the reviewer comments. Acknowledge that aspect. Thank them. Be polite in your response. So how do we select our research topic? This is particularly important. We all have got our own areas of interest. Like I work in most of the cases, I work in leadership, social responsibility, internal marketing, and knowledge management. I do not move around away from these topics actually, because I it's just like in my nature. Even though I've done my master's in HR, my PhD is more or less in HR related topics, but I never work in compensation, because sometimes some ways I find this particular compensation, the concept of compensation, very dry, very difficult to understand. So I do not teach compensation, and I do not work in the field of compensation. I do not work in performance management as well. I find that dry as well. What's interesting for me is internal marketing, something related to human behaviors. What interests me is corporate social responsibilities. A majority of my publications you will find in knowledge management or corporate social responsibility or leadership, because these topics interest me. Something that when I'm reading these topics, they don't bore me, and I'm able to talk at length about these topics. Maybe for 6 7 hours, I can easily talk about leadership. So choose a topic that is of interest. If somebody says to you, okay, this topic you can, if you work on this topic, this it will be very easy to publish. Do not go for such topics, because you might be able to publish one or two papers on that, but in the long run you will suffer. So always choose a topic of interest. Now, how do you identify research gaps? Search through latest research, and do not search any database or any journal just like by typing into Google Scholar or maybe anything in the Google. Yes, use Google Scholar, but only go for the papers that are published in these good databases in business and management, like Emerald, Sage, Springer, Science Direct, Wiley, Taylor, and Francis Gestor. Those that are indexed in Web of Science or Scopus, those who have got impact factor or are in emerging social sciences citation index or emerging sciences citation index. Do not just read any paper, because if you read bad you will produce bad. Try to read, if you read 4-star 3-star journal papers, I can bet you can publish in 3 stars or 2-star journals. But if you are reading from some journal which has just recently started and is taking money to publish research, they will not have quality whatsoever. So select latest research. If you are looking to identify gaps, if you are looking to identify gaps in previous research or previous studies, look for latest research, maybe previous 6 months, so that your gaps are very latest. Now, explicit research gap. For example, if I open a paper and I go into its, let's say this is the paper, it's recently published, and I'm looking to work on CSR in hospitality. So I come across this paper, very latest paper published maybe last 2-3 months, and this is the model. And let's see what they have recommended. So I will go into limitations and future research direction of this paper. So they took 3 countries we can take, and they have recommended that other countries might be involved, and longitudinal data may be collected. But what is important for us is that they have recommended that future studies could also ascertain the mediating role of other variables on the linkage between CSR and loyalty that may include positive word of mouth, trust, or credibility. So they have recommended new variables. So the what aspect of contribution is done. What you need to do is now you need to look into the word of mouth, trust, or credibility related papers. And once you look into those papers, you can identify the why aspect of contribution as well. So this is something, this is explicit gap. Implicit gap, for example, I'm searching through the literature and I can't find anything on, say, leadership in public sector organization, like entrepreneurial leadership in public sector organization or knowledge oriented leadership in higher education. So I'm interested in knowledge oriented leadership, but I can't find anything on this. So this is implicit research gap. Somebody or someone might not have explicitly talked about studying knowledge oriented leadership in public sector organizations, but I couldn't find a paper. So this is something that you came by yourself. So this is your implicit research gap. But again, you will have to explain why studying this particular concept in this particular setting is important. Document your gaps, limitations in existing research. Create an Excel sheet and put all that particular information in that Excel sheet. Put in the title, put in why they conducted that particular study, why did they or how did they explain why that particular study was important. This will not only give you an idea as to why particular studies are important, this will also give you an idea as to how to write the why aspect of contribution in your own study. Identify the limitations of existing research. Note the future research direction. So you create an Excel sheet and put all these things in there so that you have got a record as to where did you read about this information. Where did you get this information from? Because you will have to put reference for everything that you are putting in. So if you do not have literature support or theoretical support for your ideas, your paper will be rejected. Now, how do you document the literature review? Now it will help in keeping track of what you have done so that you don't have to repeat unproductive searches. So you know everything that you have went through or everything that you have read, you put it in an Excel sheet. So you don't have to go back again searching, again losing on to your valuable time, because everything is there in that particular Excel sheet. You might have to just search and retrieve it. Reuse successful research strategies. So if you document your literature review, you know how you got that particular information. So you do not have to rethink again and again as to how to search for literature. Describe your search process for manuscript. Now what I normally do is, if I can't find any information on a particular concept, and that's an implicit gap, what I do is I mention in my paper, in my introduction, while I'm explaining gaps, that I mention that I search Web of Science and I used this procedure and I couldn't find a particular paper, or I couldn't find much on this particular concept. And this adds weight to my study, because Web of Science is acceptable all around the world. It's trusted all around the world. So this will strengthen my research. Justify the search process. Obviously, if you are using Scopus or Web of Science and you mention the search strings that you have used, this is the justification for the search process. And obviously, once you have got, or once you have tracked all the information, once you have put in all the information, once you have got all the information in an Excel sheet, it will help you build a critical literature review. Because once you are copying the information, actually you are reading the information. Once you are reading the information and putting this into your Excel sheet, all those together, and once you print those Excel sheet and start reading them, you will be able to join the dots. And this joining of the dots will help you propose a more critical literature review. Rather than just copying and pasting from your PDF documents, this will not make your literature critical. So what to document? Again, just a recap. Create an Excel sheet with these columns: title, the objectives of that particular paper that you are reading, the research question or hypothesis that they have proposed, the theory that they have used. Now, once you have got 20-30 papers in an Excel sheet and you want to know what theory I could use for my research, just go back to the Excel sheet, see what theories have been used with that particular variable, and read the theory and see if it fits. Variables, what variables did they have in their study? The independent, the dependent, the mediator, the moderator, the control variables. What gaps did they address, so that you are not overlapping or you are not doing a repeat study? The sample size and technique they use, this will also help you to identify, okay, what sample size and techniques have been used in existing research, so that you use the same, because this will add to the acceptability of your research. And then you can also refer in your methodology that these papers have used this sample size and techniques, and make your research more authentic and valid. Who are the respondents in existing research? For example, if I'm studying, let's say, entrepreneurship, so I can't just study entrepreneurship in banks and take data from normal people who are working in bank branches, because they are not allowed to be innovative. They are not allowed to be allowed to move away from the procedures that are implemented by the high ups or the regulatory bodies. So I will know that if I am studying a particular variable, these are the respondents that have been studied this variable with. The results, store the results, because this will help you in writing the discussion section, because now you know what results were there in existing research. Now you can compare and contrast your findings with existing research. The limitations of existing research, so that you can propose your own model for future studies. And finally, what future research directions did the existing research propose? And based on those future research directions, by identifying the mediators, moderators, or any other future research direction, you can propose your own study. So what are the key ingredients that one should have in the introduction section? You start by value of the topic. Why is this topic important? Do not just jump directly into the limitations of existing research. Identify with why this particular topic is important. And if you are focusing on a particular area or study setting, Identify why studying this particular area is important, and or why is there a need to study this particular concept in this particular area. What existing research is available on these variables? What relationships have been studied? Because this will help you situate the problem in a more adequate manner. So the reader knows that this research has been done and now this research is proposed. Now, how do you fill? Or limitations, gaps, future research directions on your topic based on previous studies? So what are the limitations of existing research? But these should be latest. You do not like type in that in 1992 somebody recommended this particular study. You can't evaluate or assess the impact of, let's say, CSR on organizational commitment in current scenario, because that has been done 5 years ago. Even if somebody has recommended that in 2014, you can't use that particular reference now, because that has already been done and it's a very old reference. What is your theoretical lens? How do you plan to establish the relationship between variables? Now, how do I find the theory? If I've got these papers and I put it in Mendeley or in my Excel sheet where I've stored about theory, I can just go back to Mendeley, search theory, and see if this particular theory or what theories have been used in existing research in relation to this particular variable that I am studying, and whether this theory or that particular theory will help me explain this relationship. If yes, use that theoretical lens in your study. Contribution of your study to the body of knowledge. Again, this is one of the major reasons your paper might be rejected. So write a paragraph on what are the contribution of your study to the body of knowledge. How do you know that? How do I write? Read any good paper published in these journals or these databases that I've already mentioned. If you read through those papers, you will always find contribution paragraph or a paragraph or two on contribution within the introduction or theoretical contribution right at the end in the discussion section. Proposed structure of your thesis or your research paper rather. So how are you going to structure your thesis? But obviously this is something that if the journals wants you to write, you can write it, and if you want to save space for start, just don't write it, and if they require, they can always mention to you that propose the structure of your paper. So how do you write the literature review? What are the key elements or ingredients of the literature review? What are the things that should be part of your literature review? The purpose of literature review is to help the researcher build on the work of others and to make informed decisions during the various stages of research project. A review of literature identifies and highlights relevant themes and documents significant findings, frameworks, and or instruments from earlier research that will serve as the foundation of current project. So you will know what has been done, what relationships have been tested, what were the results of the relationship, what theories have been used, what were the findings, and what scales have been used in existing research to measure these variables that you are interested in. Now document your literature review. Again, this is very important. If you want to save time, you will see that, okay, once you are documenting your literature review, what will happen is you will see that this is very boring, this is very monotonous, and this is some sort of that will give you some headache as well. But once you have documented your literature review, once you have stored that particular information, now when you start writing your paper, your life will be much easier. So document your literature review, save the information. So literature review, there is individual or independent discussion on variables. For example, we go through a paper or we see a paper, there are three variables: corporate social responsibility, employee commitment, and organizational performance. So what you will see is in literature review, before they start developing the hypothesis, you will see three headings: corporate social responsibility, organizational commitment, and organizational performance. So there is individual discussion on these variables. And what does this individual discussion include? This will include, and the second part is obviously how to write when developing framework, obviously when you are developing your hypothesis. So how do you write this individual discussion? You start with the concept of variable. Define your variable. How do you plan to operationalize your variable? Is there any conceptualization of the variable? If you are studying a particular area, if you are studying maybe higher education, do the researchers or early researchers have defined this concept in higher education context? How the definitions have evolved or changed over time? maybe 2 3 definitions, and you identify that okay, in 1990s this concept was defined as this. With time it has evolved, and these are the new ingredients or attributes or characteristics of this concept now. Again, identify the key traits or characteristics that emerge from the definition. Do these definitions agree on something, or they contradict each other, or they complement each other? What does the variable do for organizing? Why studying this particular variable is important? It is not that you just put in the definitions and the characteristics. You have to identify why this particular variable is important to be studied. Again, that why aspect. Why is it important if you are focusing on a particular area? Now, what is the status of literature in this field? Is it limited? So what are the limitations of this study? Now, obviously, all these things, these 7, 8, 9 points that I'm mentioning, you cannot include all this in the paper. But most of them, like the concept of the variable, why this particular variable is important, and is or does this particular variable have any significant importance in a particular area that you are studying, and why this particular variable or assessing this variable will help you in the field of study, or how will the assessment of variable help in the field of study, and what are the common measurements available for this study, what common scales are used to measure this particular variable. Again, this is not what we normally see, but I've tried to be exhaustive in my list depending on the journal that you are publishing in and the gaps you are studying. Sometimes what happens is you mention about the measurement in your literature because existing research has used a particular measurement, and that particular measurement may have some flaws. So you are proposing a new measurement, a new scale to assess the relationships. In that case, you should mention about the dimension and measurement. Okay, I've already mentioned what conceptualization, operationalization you are using in your study. You can mention it here with the point number 1 or in the end. Next, be cautious. Your literature review should not look like annotated bibliography, but rather a story where ideas and concepts are linked with each other. This is very important. Do not just put X said this, Y said this, Latif said this, Ali said this, and somebody said this. This is not critical literature review. And try to use latest references because whenever you are highlighting the importance of the concept, because this will show that this concept is very current, up to date. So when you are developing relationship, when you are developing your hypothesis, how do you write your literature? What are the key ingredients? The first one, has previous studies linked the two concepts? If yes, what were their findings? Are the variables in any way linked with each other? If you could not find any two previous studies or any previous studies rather, so if you are proposing a relationship between these variables, how are they linked with each other? Explain. Were the findings of the previous studies unanimous, or they on the other hand contradictory? Now, for instance, I read one study where they studied the impact of CSR on organizational performance and they found a positive relationship. I read another study, there was a negative relationship between these two variables. Now, these are contradictory results. Do identify these contradictory results in your study, because this will give weight to your study. This will identify the need for your study. Why studying the linkage between variable is significant important? Why should these variables or these relationships should be studied? It's not just important that you mentioned, okay, yes, these variables have been studied, or these variables have not been studied, or they have contradictory results. You also have to mention why. Again, that why aspect is important. Why studying the linkage between, if you have got a particular area, maybe higher education, maybe government sector, maybe any other area. So why studying these relationship is important in your area or field of study. How the independent variable affects, influences, impacts the dependent variable. Do the dimension traits of if you are focusing on dimensions of the study of the variable, and if you are studying particular traits, you have to identify how these traits are linked to the dependent variable, so that you can your hypothesis is more of an educated guess, something that is very proper. and use theory to develop linkages. Without theory, your argument is weak. Where do you find these theories? Again, see the papers on the variables that you are studying and you will find the theories. How do you write your research methodology? The first thing, mention the population for the study. The second thing, what sample size and sampling technique are you using, and justify the sampling technique. Maybe explain the sampling technique a bit and mention reference as to this sampling technique has been used in existing research on these variables that may be part of your study as well. How the questionnaire was distributed. What are the sources of the questionnaire? If it's primary data, you have to mention the sources of the questionnaire. If it's secondary data, mention the data sources. How did you collect the data? What were the data collection techniques? What were the analysis techniques? Regression model, propose and put your regression model when you are working in finance or economics. We do not put regression model if you are doing perceptual studies in HR, marketing or general management. And how do you do your data analysis? You start with your descriptive statistics. So you can explain the what and when of your data. Then identify the reliability if you are doing primary research based on questionnaire. So how do you check reliability? Go for Cron-Batch alpha or composite reliability. Identify or establish the convergent and discriminant validity. You can use different softwares. You can use maybe Smart PLS, AMOS or any other software to establish convergent and discriminant validity. Then test your hypothesis and report the hypothesis results. And do not just test it and report it without looking at the papers as to how they report the results. Read through the existing papers. Whatever journal that you are focusing on, see how they are reporting results, how they prefer their results to be reported. Present a summary of your hypothesis. If you have got too many hypotheses, a table with a summary is a very good idea. How do you write discussion? I've come across papers where they do not actually put any discussion. They are just putting in the conclusion of the study. So how do you write the discussion? You start with the objective of your study. Give your reader an idea as to what you are writing about. Compare the results of your study with the results from the previous research. Now, where are these results from the previous research? You have mentioned about them in your literature, so you use the same reference. This will add to the strength of your study. Do not go for just new references for your discussion, because you have built a whole building on or whole concept on the references in the literature. Try using the same references. This will save you space as well. Now, not just how the results compare to existing research, why this relationship is significant or insignificant. Most of the times what we do is, this is a very serious problem, that what we do is we say that, okay, yes, our results are similar to this study. But you have to explain why. Why is your results significant or insignificant? Why does the significance and insignificance of relationship show in your field of study? So you have to relate this why aspect to your field of study and use the theory. If you are explaining or if you are putting in the discussion, use the theory to explain how these results match to the theory. Are they complementing the theory or are they contradicting the theory? It's always critical to incorporate the theory that you have utilized to establish the relationship as a mean to explain why or why not certain relationship exists. This is particularly important when there is lack of existing research in a particular area of research or relationship that have not been previously established. If you are establishing something new and you do not have any record or results from existing research, how are you going to explain the why aspect? How are you going to explain that whether or not this particular relationship contradict or complement existing research? The only thing is, use the theory and see what the theory says, that what would be the expected relationship between the variables. And then you write your conclusion. An overall conclusion from your research in light of research objectives. Again, start your conclusion by just a single line on what were the research objectives of your study, or 2 lines. Then you mention your limitations of the study. What were the limitations in terms of sample, data collection, measurement or analysis? Are there any conceptual limitations? and then your future research directions. What are your recommendations that the future researcher should do? Recommend any variables, mediators, moderators, antecedents, or outcomes. Would you like future research to change the conceptual scope of the study? New measures might be used, new variables might be used, new relationships might be tested, and if you want them to use different analytical techniques in future, obviously you can recommend those as well. Implications, very important. How does this research benefit the individuals or management in the organization? What are the policy implications for your study? What are the theoretical implications for your study? What have you done for the theory? In the contribution, in the introduction, you have mentioned about your contribution, but those are proposed contribution. Once you have completed your study, what are the theoretical implications? What have you done for the research or the body of knowledge? Now, once you are doing a paper, now here is an introduction. So what is included in the introduction? As I have already mentioned, you start with value of your research. So this is the value. You start with why this particular variable, why this particular concept is important. And in this case, what we did was we merged the value and the area all together. So we studied this concept of corporate social responsibility and customer loyalty in hotel industry. It was a cross-country study, and it published in International Journal of Hospitality Management. And what we started with the hotel industry and their role towards the environment and their social responsibility. And we are mentioning, for this purpose, in last decade, hotel managers have been especially worried to present corporate social responsibility as a strategy to establish or accomplish their corporate goals. So your first paragraph is your value. Why this particular concept is important, and in here we have merged value with the area. Furthermore, the next paragraph, CSR is important, and it's very important, and these things, and now we rather focused on the gaps. So once you have identified the value of the concepts, the next step is, what are the gaps in existing research? Why studying this particular research is important? What are the limitations of existing research? So with reference, latest reference, nevertheless, whether CSR satisfactorily explains customer loyalty in the hotel industry is still not empirically clear. And hence the issue requires further research. More precisely, two specific research gaps persist along. It was just not enough to mention, okay, yes, there is no research. You have to explain your gaps in detail. How do you explain your gaps in detail? In order to do that, first, customer loyalty is agreed. Now you identify that why this particular concept is important. And then based on that identification, okay, yes, why this, or this is how this particular important. The conceptual models that have been proposed to describe its formation, the formation of customer loyalty, and relation to CSR continue to finish off with the inclusion of additional variables with explicative power. Now, it's not enough just to mention the limitations. You have to explain why this particular concept is important, and in detail, what are the limitations of existing research with references. You have to explain your gaps in detail. And finally, the contributions of the study. In covering these gaps, so that the gaps that you have explained earlier, the study provides several contributions to previous literature. So what are the contributions? The first, giving a relative scarcity of available integrative research, this paper responds to numerous calls for scholars to ascertain the mediating mechanisms through which customer perceptions of CSR impact customer loyalty in hotel industry. So these are the gaps that we filled in our research. And it's always a good idea to mention first, second, third gaps in your research. So this is how you mention the contributions of the study in the introduction. I mean, we did not mention the structure because that was not required. Again, moving on with the literature review, CSR was the important variable in our study on which we based our gaps along with loyalty. So we explained it separately. And moving on, then we developed our hypothesis. A table to show that what research has been done in this particular area. So this also adds to your study. Now, what theories did we use? For example, there is this signaling theory that we use to explain the relationship between CSR, image, and reputation. So, moving on, research methodology, the survey used, the analysis techniques used, how the questionnaires were distributed, what were the responses, and all. This was the model. The questionnaire attached, common method bias assessed, the reliability and validity, descriptive analysis, structural model, the reliability and validity is everything conducted, discriminant validity reported, then the hypothesis results, the mediation, the multi-group analysis, and finally the discussion and conclusion based on existing research. You will see a lot of blues in here. These are references from existing research. And hypothesis results, implications, theoretical implications, limitations and future research direction, and finally references. So all the things that I've mentioned previously in my presentation, you'll find all these things here in this paper.